The helicopter appeared exactly 4 hours after Decker Holbrook won the auction. He was standing in his kitchen, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, when the sound of rotor blades cut through the afternoon silence like a knife through fabric. The machine landed in his front pasture without permission, without explanation, and without any regard for the fence posts it knocked over. 3 people in dark suits emerged before the dust settled. The woman leading them walked straight to his porch and knocked once. When Decker opened the door, she didn't introduce herself, didn't apologize for the damaged fence, didn't explain why a corporate helicopter was on his property. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and asked, "Where's the item from today's auction?" As if she already knew, as if she'd been watching. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millfield County. Decker had driven his rusted pickup truck to the Thornton Estate auction, hoping to find some used ranch equipment he could actually afford. His property needed repairs he couldn't pay for, his cattle needed feeding he couldn't manage, and his bank account needed a miracle he wasn't expecting. The auction was supposed to be simple. Mabel Thornton had died 6 months ago, leaving behind a lifetime's worth of belongings that her city relatives wanted gone. Decker arrived early, parked between other pickups driven by neighbors in similar situations, and prepared to bid on whatever tools he could get for under $50. The bidding started with furniture, moved through household items, and eventually reached the barn equipment. Decker managed to win a toolbox for $35 and felt satisfied with his purchase. But then Mabel's nephew dragged out a locked metal box, about the size of a large suitcase, covered in dust and bearing no identification marks. The auctioneer, Jimmy Kessler, held it up and announced, "Don't know what's in here, folks. Hasn't been opened in decades. Starting bid is $5. The crowd showed little interest. Most people were there for practical items they could use immediately. A mystery storage case held no appeal for farmers struggling to make ends meet. Decker found himself raising his hand when the bidding stalled at $12. Something about the container intrigued him, though he couldn't explain what. Maybe it was the weight Jimmy struggled with when lifting it, suggesting valuable contents. Maybe it was the way Mabel's nephew seemed eager to get rid of it, avoiding eye contact with potential bidders. Maybe it was just curiosity about what an old woman might have considered important enough to lock away. When no one else bid, Decker won the storage case for his small investment. Now, staring at the woman on his porch, Decker realized his curiosity might have cost him more than his bargain purchase. The container sat unopened in his truck bed, exactly where he'd placed it after loading his other purchases. But somehow these people knew he had it. Somehow they'd tracked him to his property within hours of the auction ending. The woman's question echoed in his mind as he studied her face, searching for answers she clearly wasn't planning to provide voluntarily. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate compliance. "Where is the thing?" Decker stepped back from the door, his mind racing through possibilities that made no sense. The woman remained on his porch, patient, but clearly expecting an answer. Behind her, 2 men in similar dark suits flanked the helicopter, their posture suggesting they were prepared for various outcomes to this conversation. The machine's engines continued running, rotors spinning lazily, ready for immediate departure. Whatever they wanted, they didn't plan on staying long. "I bought a toolbox and a locked case," Decker said carefully, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. "Both items are legally mine. I have the receipts." He gestured toward his pickup truck parked near the barn. "Everything's right there if you want to see the paperwork." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction at having confirmation of something she already knew. "Mr. Holbrook," she said, and Decker felt his stomach drop. She knew his name. She'd come here knowing exactly who had bought whatever she was looking for. This wasn't a random visit or a case of mistaken identity. This was planned. "My name is Agent Rivera. I represent certain business interests that have a legitimate claim to the contents of that storage unit. We're prepared to compensate you generously for its return." Agent Rivera reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick with what appeared to be cash. "There's $5,000 here. Mr. Holbrook, more than enough to cover your purchase and provide significant profit for your trouble. All we need is the container and any contents you may have examined." Decker stared at the envelope, his mind struggling to process the situation. $5,000 for his auction win. The math didn't work unless the storage unit held something extraordinarily valuable, something worth enough to justify chartering a helicopter. tracking down the buyer and arriving with prepared cash offers. Something worth enough to make powerful people nervous about who had possession of it. I haven't opened the storage unit, Decker said slowly. Still locked, just like it was at the auction. This seemed to relieve Agent Rivera further, though she tried to hide her reaction. But before I consider any deal, I need to understand what's going on here. What's so important about an old woman's storage box that it brings corporate helicopters to my property? Agent Rivera's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been urgency beneath her controlled exterior. Mr. Holbrook, there are certain documents that were misplaced several decades ago. Documents that contain sensitive information related to land rights and mineral surveys in this region. If those documents fell into the wrong hands, they could cause significant legal complications for ongoing business operations. The explanation raised more questions than answers. Mabel Thornton had lived in Millfield County her entire life. She farmed the same land her family had worked for generations. What kind of documents would she have possessed that could threaten business operations decades later? And why had these powerful interests waited until after her death to pursue recovery? What kind of legal complications? Decker asked, sensing that Agent Rivera was revealing more than she intended. The woman's jaw tightened, suggesting he'd touched on something she preferred not to discuss in detail. The kind that could result in significant property disputes and mineral rights challenges across several thousand acres of currently productive land, she said. The kind that could affect numerous families and businesses if handled improperly. Decker felt the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. His small gamble had apparently connected him to something much larger and more dangerous than a simple estate auction. The $5,000 suddenly seemed less like generous compensation and more like urgent damage control. Decker looked at the envelope full of cash, then back at Agent Rivera's face. $5,000 would solve his immediate financial problems, pay for the fence repairs his cattle desperately needed, and buy feed to last through the winter months ahead. But accepting money from people who arrived by helicopter to retrieve documents they claimed were misplaced felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Something about their urgency suggested these weren't simply lost papers being recovered through normal channels. Before I make any decisions, Decker said, I need to see what's actually in that storage unit. I have a right to know what I'm selling. Agent Rivera's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing what looked like genuine concern beneath her controlled exterior. She exchanged quick glances with her associates near the helicopter, some form of silent communication passing between them. Mr. Holbrook, I strongly advise against opening that case, she said. The documents inside are extremely sensitive. Simply possessing them could place you in legal jeopardy with federal regulations regarding classified historical surveys. The warning sounded official enough, but something in her tone suggested she was more worried about what he might discover than what laws he might violate. Decker walked toward his pickup truck, Agent Rivera following close behind. The metal case sat in his truck bed exactly where he'd placed it after the auction. Its lock still intact, its contents still unknown. Up close he could see scratches and dents that suggested significant age, along with what appeared to be official markings that had been deliberately filed away or painted over. Whatever identification this storage unit once bore had been intentionally removed. These legal complications you mentioned, Decker said, running his fingers along the case's edges. Would they affect people who own property in this area? Agent Rivera's silence was answer enough. Would they affect mining operations that are currently extracting resources from local land? Her jaw tightened, confirming his suspicions. Mr. Holbrook, there are larger forces at work here than you understand, she said. Forces that have invested significant capital in regional development projects based on current legal frameworks. Disrupting those frameworks could harm entire communities that depend on those investments for employment and economic stability. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Decker had lived in Millfield County long enough to know how mining companies operated. They arrived with promises of jobs and prosperity, extracted what they wanted, then left behind damaged land and broken communities. If these documents could challenge their legal right to operate, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. What if I refuse your offer? Decker asked. Agent Rivera's expression hardened, the friendly business negotiation veneer disappearing completely. What happens if I decide to open this case and see what's so valuable about papers that belong to a dead woman? Then you would be making a serious mistake, she replied. One that could affect not only your own financial future, but the economic stability of this entire region. Mining operations employ hundreds of local families, Mr. Holbrook. Legal challenges to their operational permits could result in immediate job losses and economic hardship for people who have nothing to do with historical disputes. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cross powerful mining interests and watch your neighbors suffer the consequences. Decker realized he was being asked to choose between his own curiosity and his community's welfare. But something about Agent Rivera's desperation told him the choice might not be as simple as she was presenting it. "I need time to think about this," Decker said. Agent Rivera checked her watch, another crack in her professional facade. "You have until tomorrow morning, Mr. Holbrook. After that, this generous offer expires, and other methods of recovery may become necessary." The helicopter lifted off 20 minutes later, leaving behind tire tracks in Decker's pasture and a cloud of questions that seemed heavier than the dust settling on his property. Agent Rivera had climbed aboard without another word, but her parting look carried a promise that tomorrow's deadline was not negotiable. Decker stood in his driveway, watching the aircraft disappear over the tree line, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into with a $15 impulse purchase. He walked back to his pickup truck and stared at the storage case. In daylight, away from the pressure of Agent Rivera's presence, he could examine it more carefully. The metal was older than he'd initially thought, probably dating back to the 1970s based on the construction style. Someone had definitely removed identifying marks, but they'd missed a small stamped number on the bottom corner, Survey Designation 7749. The number meant nothing to him, but it suggested official government origin. Decker had lived next to Mabel Thornton for 15 years, sharing a property line and occasional conversations about weather and cattle prices. She'd been a private woman, friendly enough, but never one to discuss family history or personal business. Her husband had died young, leaving her to work the farm alone until age forced her to lease the land to larger operations. What could a widow farmer have possessed that threatened million-dollar mining investments? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Smart people make smart choices. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Holbrook." No signature, but the timing and tone made the sender obvious. They were monitoring his communications. They were tracking his location. They were probably watching his property right now. The realization sent a chill down his spine, despite the afternoon heat. Decker made a decision that surprised himself. Instead of opening the storage case immediately, he loaded it into his truck and drove to the Millfield County Courthouse. If these documents were related to land rights and mineral surveys, there might be public records that could provide context before he committed to any course of action. The courthouse stayed open until 5 o'clock, giving him enough time to do research before returning home. The county clerk, Patricia Chen, had worked in the records office for 20 years and knew local property history better than most lawyers. When Decker explained his interest in historical mineral surveys for the Thornton property, her expression shifted from helpful bureaucrat to concerned neighbor. "You're not the first person asking about those records this week," Patricia said quietly, glancing around the empty office. 3 men in suits came by Tuesday morning, wanting copies of all mineral rights documentation for that area dating back to 1970. They had federal credentials and proper paperwork, so I had to comply with their request. Tuesday morning was the day before Mabel's auction. Someone had been preparing for this situation before Decker ever raised his hand to bid. They'd known the storage case would be sold. They'd known it contained sensitive information. They'd positioned themselves to control the aftermath. His auction win had been anticipated and planned for. "Patricia, what exactly did you give them?" Decker asked. Her answer would determine whether opening the case would provide information these people didn't already possess, or simply confirm what they were trying to keep hidden. "Copies of every mineral rights transfer, every survey report, and every legal challenge filed in this county since 1970, she said. "But here's the strange part, Decker. The original documents they were most interested in? They've been missing from our files for over a decade. Someone removed them years ago, and we've been working from incomplete records ever since." Patricia's words hit Decker like cold water. The original documents had been missing from county files for over a decade, which meant whatever was in the storage case might be the only remaining proof of something powerful people wanted to keep buried. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had removed those records years ago, anticipating that someday the backup copies might surface. They'd been planning this cover-up for longer than anyone realized. "Patricia, who has access to remove documents from county files?" Decker asked. She looked around the empty office again, lowering her voice even though they were alone. "Only county officials, state representatives with proper authorization, or federal agents with court orders. But there's no record of any official request to remove those specific files. They just disappeared during a routine reorganization in 2014. Decker felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking together. 2014 was the same year Meridian Mining Corporation had begun large-scale operations in Millfield County. The same year several local families had received substantial offers to sell mineral rights they didn't know they possessed. The same year Mabel Thornton had stopped talking to neighbors about family history and started keeping to herself. He thanked Patricia and drove home as the sun was setting, the metal case sitting beside him like an unexploded bomb. By the time he reached his property, he'd made his decision. Agent Rivera's deadline was tomorrow morning, but Decker couldn't make an informed choice about $5,000 without knowing what he was selling. The case was legally his, purchased at a public auction with proper documentation. Whatever was inside belonged to him until he decided otherwise. Decker parked near his workshop, carried the case inside, and found his bolt cutters. The lock was old but sturdy, requiring several minutes of careful cutting before the metal finally gave way. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the lid, unsure whether he was about to solve a mystery or create a bigger problem for himself. Inside, wrapped in yellowed plastic, were dozens of files dating from the 1970s. Survey maps, mineral assessment reports, land title transfers, and correspondence on official letterheads from the Bureau of Land Management. But it was the folder marked Confidential Meridian Mining Analysis that made Decker's blood run cold. These weren't random historical papers. They were evidence of a systematic fraud that had been occurring for over 40 years. The files showed that Meridian Mining Corporation had been extracting valuable copper and lithium deposits from land they didn't legally own. Through falsified surveys and corrupted title transfers, they'd been stealing mining rights that belonged to local families, including the Thorntons. The original surveys proved that mineral deposits extended far beyond the boundaries Meridian had purchased, technically making them thieves operating under the protection of fraudulent paperwork. One paper stood out among the rest, a handwritten note from Mabel's late husband, Earl Thornton, dated 1978. Company men offered $5,000 for mineral rights to our north pasture. Told them no because our family survey shows the good deposits are actually under our house and barn. They didn't like hearing that. Mary says we should hide these papers somewhere safe. Something about those men made her nervous. Decker now understood why powerful people were willing to pay $5,000 for his auction win, and why they'd arrived within hours of the sale. These files proved that dozens of local families owned mining rights worth millions of dollars, rights that Meridian Mining had been stealing for decades, while paying landowners nothing for the privilege of making them rich. Decker was photographing the evidence with his cell phone when he heard vehicles approaching his property. Multiple engines, driving fast, headlights cutting through the darkness outside his workshop windows. He quickly stuffed the papers back into the case and moved to the window. 3 black SUVs had pulled into his driveway, blocking any potential escape route. Agent Rivera emerged from the lead vehicle, but this time she wasn't alone. 6 men in tactical gear followed her toward his workshop, moving with military precision. "Mr. Holbrook," Agent Rivera called out, her voice carrying none of the professional courtesy from their earlier conversation. "We know you've opened the case. We're here to retrieve our property and discuss your violation of federal security protocols." The accusation was absurd. There were no federal security protocols governing estate auction purchases, but the armed men surrounding his workshop suggested legal accuracy was no longer their primary concern. Decker realized they'd been monitoring him more closely than he'd imagined. Somehow they knew he'd cut the lock and examined the contents. Either they had surveillance equipment on his property, or they'd been tracking the case itself through some kind of electronic device. The speed of their response suggested they'd been waiting nearby, ready to move the moment he crossed their line in the sand. "The papers in that case are classified materials that were stolen from government facilities decades ago," Agent Rivera shouted. "Possessing them is a federal crime punishable by 20 years in prison. Open the door, surrender the materials, and we can resolve this situation without involving law enforcement." But Decker had seen enough government paperwork in his time to know the difference between classified materials and corporate fraud evidence. The files in the case bore no classification markings, no security stamps, no federal agency identifiers. They were private survey reports and mining company correspondence that proved systematic theft of mineral rights. Agent Rivera was lying about federal crimes to justify an illegal seizure of evidence that would destroy her employers. He grabbed the case and moved toward the back exit of his workshop, hoping to reach his truck before they surrounded the building completely. But as he opened the rear door, 2 tactical officers were waiting for him, weapons drawn but not yet pointed in his direction. They clearly preferred to resolve this quietly, rather than create a situation that might attract unwanted attention from actual law enforcement. "Mr. Holbrook, don't make this more difficult than necessary," one of the officers said. "We have authorization to retrieve stolen government property by any means required. Surrender the case and walk away with the $5,000 Agent Rivera offered. Everyone goes home happy and no one gets hurt." Decker looked at the armed men, then at the case in his hands, weighing his options. These people had committed decades of fraud worth millions of dollars, and they were willing to use armed intimidation to protect their illegal profits. But they were also outnumbered by local families who deserved to know they owned valuable mineral rights. The evidence in his hands could change dozens of lives, restore stolen wealth to people who'd been cheated for 40 years. "Before I give you anything," Decker said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded, "I want to know something. How many families in this county have you stolen from? How many people are living in poverty while you get rich from minerals under their land?" Agent Rivera's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "Mr. Holbrook, you have 10 seconds to surrender that case, or we're going to take it from you and explain to local sheriff's department that you were found in possession of stolen federal evidence. Your choice." But Decker had already made his choice. The moment these people had arrived with weapons instead of lawyers, they'd revealed that everything in the case was true. Decker had grown up on this property and knew every inch of the terrain better than any armed intruder could learn in a single visit. While Agent Rivera counted down from 10, he was already calculating his route through the darkness beyond his workshop. The drainage ditch that ran behind his barn would provide cover for the first 100 yards, leading to the tree line where his neighbors couldn't see whatever was about to happen on his property. "Time's up, Mr. Holbrook," Agent Rivera announced. The tactical officers began moving toward him from multiple directions, their coordination suggesting professional military training. But Decker had spent 15 years maintaining this land, repairing fences in every weather condition, chasing escaped cattle through every possible hiding place his property offered. He threw himself sideways through the workshop's rear exit, rolling behind a stack of fence posts as the officers rushed forward. The case clutched tightly against his chest. Decker sprinted toward the drainage ditch, using his knowledge of every hole and obstacle to navigate safely through terrain that would trip up unfamiliar pursuers. Behind him, he could hear Agent Rivera shouting orders and tactical officers crashing through brush they couldn't see clearly. Decker reached his neighbor's fence line and climbed through the wire gap he'd been meaning to repair for months. Tom Martinez had been his neighbor for 8 years, and their properties shared more than a boundary line. They shared the same struggles with corporate mining operations that had been pressuring local families to sell land for prices that never seemed quite fair. He pounded on Tom's back door until lights came on throughout the house. When Tom appeared, still pulling on a shirt, Decker thrust the metal case into his hands and quickly explained what the documents proved about mineral rights theft. Tom's expression shifted from confusion to anger, as he understood that his family might own valuable deposits they'd never been told about. "Call every neighbor you can reach," Decker said breathlessly. "Tell them to come to your house right now and bring their property deeds. Call the county sheriff and tell him you have evidence of corporate fraud involving mineral rights. Call the local newspaper and tell them you have proof of a story that affects dozens of families." Tom nodded and reached for his phone, while Decker explained the contents of the case in detail. The evidence showed that Meridian Mining had been systematically defrauding landowners across the entire county, using falsified surveys to claim mining rights that legally belonged to farming families. The files proved specific theft affecting the Martinez property, the Johnson Ranch, the Williams Farm, and at least 20 other local families. Within 30 minutes, Tom's house was filled with neighbors who'd driven over in response to urgent phone calls. Sheriff's deputies arrived shortly after, followed by a reporter from the county newspaper who'd been investigating Meridian Mining's business practices for months without finding the proof he needed. Agent Rivera's tactical team had searched Decker's property thoroughly, but by then the evidence was already in the hands of local authorities and surrounded by witnesses. When Agent Rivera finally appeared at Tom's house with her armed escort, she found herself facing 2 sheriff's deputies, a newspaper reporter, and 15 angry property owners who were examining evidence that proved they'd been robbed for decades. The situation had evolved beyond intimidation tactics into a public legal matter that required lawyers rather than weapons. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Sheriff Deputy Williams said when Agent Rivera approached the house. "These folks are saying you've been threatening Mr. Holbrook over some property he bought legally at a public auction. That true?" Agent Rivera's professional mask was cracking under pressure that couldn't be resolved through corporate intimidation or tactical force. 3 months later, Decker stood in the Millfield County Courthouse watching Judge Harrison deliver the final ruling in the class action lawsuit against Meridian Mining Corporation. The files from Mabel Thornton's storage case had provided irrefutable evidence of systematic fraud spanning 4 decades, affecting 67 local families whose mining rights had been stolen through falsified surveys and corrupted title transfers. This court finds Meridian Mining Corporation liable for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to deprive property owners of their legal mining rights. Judge Harrison announced to a packed courtroom. The corporation is hereby ordered to pay $47 million in damages and return all extraction rights to their rightful owners. Effective immediately. Agent Rivera sat at the defendant's table with a team of corporate lawyers, her face showing none of the arrogance she displayed when threatening Decker with armed force. The FBI investigation that followed the discovery of the documents had revealed that she wasn't a federal agent at all, but a private security contractor hired by Meridian to recover evidence of their criminal operations through intimidation and illegal seizure. The real Agent Rivera, whose identity had been stolen for the deception, testified that Meridian Mining had been operating a sophisticated cover-up operation for years, using fake federal credentials to intimidate property owners and steal evidence of their fraud. The company had corrupted county officials, destroyed public records, and threatened families who questioned their extraction claims. Decker had received his share of the settlement money, enough to pay off his property loans and make the repairs his ranch desperately needed. But more importantly, he'd discovered something about himself during the confrontation that changed how he approached problems. Instead of accepting what powerful people told him was true, he'd chosen to investigate and fight back when he found evidence of injustice. Tom Martinez had used his settlement money to expand his cattle operation and hire 3 local workers whose families had also benefited from the lawsuit. The Johnson Ranch had been transformed from a struggling operation into a profitable business now that the family knew they owned valuable lithium deposits under their pasture land. Mrs. Williams had been able to keep her farm instead of selling to developers, thanks to discovering she owned copper rights worth more than her entire property. Sheriff Deputy Williams had been promoted to Chief Deputy after his investigation uncovered additional evidence of Meridian's corruption involving county officials who had been accepting bribes to remove documents from public files. 2 county commissioners and the former records clerk had been arrested and convicted for their roles in the conspiracy. The reporter who had covered the story won a state journalism award for exposing corporate fraud that had affected rural communities across 3 counties. His investigation revealed that Meridian Mining had been using similar tactics in other regions, leading to federal charges and congressional hearings about corporate exploitation of mineral rights laws. Patricia Chen had been named the new head of the county records office and implemented security measures to prevent future document removal without proper legal authorization and oversight. The missing files from 2014 had been restored using backup copies and testimony from families who had preserved their original property documents. Decker drove home from the courthouse that afternoon, thinking about how his small gamble had changed dozens of lives and exposed a corporate conspiracy. A conspiracy that had been operating in plain sight for 40 years. Mabel and Earl Thornton would have been proud to know their hidden documents had finally brought justice to families who had been robbed by powerful interests that thought they were beyond accountability. The helicopter that had landed in his pasture asking, "Where's the thing?" had brought him exactly what he hadn't known he was looking for: the courage to stand up to corruption and fight for what was right, regardless of how powerful the opposition appeared to be. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.